Chapter 20 From Business Culture to Great Depression, the Twenties, 1920 to 1932, Part 3 and 4. A 1925 trial in Tennessee exposed the division between traditionalism and modern secular culture. John Scopes, a public school teacher, was arrested for violating a state law that prohibited the teaching of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. His trial attracted national attention and was carried live on national radio. To fundamentalist Christians, the idea that humans had evolved over millions of years from simian ancestors contradicted the Bible's account of creation. To Scopes' defenders, including the ACLU, freedom meant the right to independent thought and self-expression, and Tennessee's law showed the dangers of mixing church and state. The well-known labor lawyer Clarence Darrow defended Scopes and created a sensation when he called William Jennings Bryan to the stand as an expert witness on the Bible. Bryan showed near complete ignorance of modern science and an inability to deflect Darrow's sarcastic interrogation regarding the factual accuracy of biblical stories. Embarrassed, Bryan died shortly after the trial ended in a guilty verdict for Scopes, though the decision was later overturned, and the movement for an anti-evolution state law expired. Many rural and small-town native-born Protestants found immigrants and their culture strange and threatening. Wartime demands for 100% Americanism persisted in the 1920s in public policy and behavior. The most militant expression of beliefs that American freedom's enjoyment should be limited according to religion and ethnicity was the rebirth of the KKK in the early 1920s. By the mid-1920s, the group claimed more than 3 million members, almost all white and native-born Protestants, many of whom were not in the South, but in the North and West. Going beyond attacks on blacks, the new Klan targeted immigrants, especially Jews and Catholics, and other forces, feminism, unions, immorality, that seemed to threaten American civilization and individual liberty. Although the Klan's influence waned by the end of the decade, its attacks on modern secularism and political radicalism, and its insistence that control of the nation be given back to the citizens of the old stock, represented popular sentiments. Many new laws transformed national identity and citizenship with newly exclusive definitions and restrictions. Immigration policy most represented this shift. Restrictions on immigration were nothing new, with the Naturalization Act of 1790 barring non-whites from migration, and the exclusion of various groups after 1875, including prostitutes and anarchists. But before World War I, the nation's doors were open to almost all white persons. In the 1920s, pressures for immigration restriction became overwhelming, signaled more than anything by the decline in the traditional opposition to restriction from employers, who had welcomed a large labor supply as a check on higher wages. Fears of immigrant-based political radicalism now outweighed demands for cheap labor, which employers found in African Americans who had left the South. A 1921 law restricted immigration from Europe to 357,000 people per year. In 1924, Congress imposed a permanent limitation on European immigration to 150,000 people per year, distributed according to a series of national quotas that sharply restricted the numbers from Southern and Eastern Europe, intended to ensure that the descendants of the old immigrants would always outnumber those of the new. The 1924 law barred entry for all of those ineligible for naturalized citizenship, all Asians except for Filipinos, who were designated American nationals. But Congress in 1934 established a timetable for the Philippines' independence, largely as a way to end immigration. The 1924 law for the first time effectively created the category of an illegal alien. The new immigration law demonstrated the intensified influence of race on public policy. By the early 1920s, both Northern and Southern political leaders agreed that blacks should be second-class citizens. But race policy did not just concern blacks, but who would be American, particularly in regard to immigration. President Coolidge's Secretary of Labor, James J. Davis, argued that immigration policy, while once based on labor needs and the ideas of America as an asylum of liberty, should now rest on a biological definition of the ideal population. The law also reflected progressives' interest in improving the quality of democratic citizenship and showed that progressive goals were infused with pseudoscientific ideas about the superiority and inferiority of particular races. The Supreme Court admitted that the entire concept of race, used to determine the immigration quotas, lacked a scientific basis when it rejected the claims of an Indian-born World War I veteran who wanted to become naturalized that he was a pure Aryan and therefore white. The court argued that white was not a scientific concept but part of common speech to be interpreted with the understanding of the common man. Some Americans resisted the notion that Southern and Eastern Europeans could not become citizens or could only do so by adopting Anglo-Saxon culture. Horace Kallen, of German Jewish origins, coined the phrase cultural pluralism to describe a society that celebrated ethnic diversity instead of suppressing it. Kallen argued that toleration of difference was uniquely American. Anthropologists such as Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict insisted that no basis existed in science for theories of racial superiority or a hierarchy of civilizations. But these had little effect on public policy. The new immigrants themselves were the best advocates of a pluralist America. Each ethnic group established its own ethnic enclaves with their own institutions, churches, theaters, and newspapers. Nevertheless, they were integrated into American culture through mass consumption and mass culture. Immigrant groups facing Prohibition, the Klan, and widespread anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism affirmed the validity of cultural diversity and defined the toleration of difference as an essential quality of American freedom. They reinvented themselves as ethnic Americans, claiming an equal right to participate in American life while remaining culturally distinct. Catholics and Jews celebrated their religious and ethnic cultures without surrendering their belief that they should not experience discrimination or bigotry in public life. The Supreme Court helped secure this shift in law by striking down a Nebraska statute prohibiting instruction in languages other than English, a law intended to ban German from education. The decades also saw a rising black self-consciousness, especially in the North's urban ghettos. Almost 1 million blacks had left the South in the Great Migration, moving to New York, Chicago, and countless smaller cities. Harlem in New York became a center of African American life, attracting migrants from the South and the West Indies, among whom were many well-educated professional and white-collar workers who were shocked by American racism. Whites slummed in Harlem, visiting its dance halls, jazz clubs, and speakeasies, contributing to depictions of Harlem as a place of primitive passions. But the real Harlem was a place of poverty and low-wage work created and reinforced by housing discrimination. Harlem contained a dynamic black cultural community with connections to New York's artistic mainstream. Poets and novelists like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay were sponsored by white intellectuals and published by white presses, and Broadway, for the first time, presented black actors in serious roles and black singers. In art, the term New Negro meant rejecting established stereotypes in a search for black values to replace them. This led the writers of what became called the Harlem Renaissance to the roots of the black experience in Africa, the rural South's folk culture, and life in the urban ghetto. Chapter 20, Part 4. Herbert Hoover seemed destined for a successful term as president. The son of an Iowa blacksmith and schoolteacher, Hoover made a fortune as a mining engineer in Asia, Africa, and Europe. He became famous for coordinating food relief in Europe during World War I. Hoover exemplified what was called the New Era of American Capitalism. In 1922, while Secretary of Commerce, Hoover published American Individualism, in which he condemned government regulation as an interference with the economic opportunities of ordinary Americans. Yet, he also argued that self-interest should be subordinated to public interest. Hoover thought himself a progressive, but he preferred what he termed associational action, in which private agencies directed regulatory and welfare policies to government intervention in economy. When Coolidge declined to run for president, Hoover won the Republican nomination, celebrated the era's prosperity, and promised an end to poverty. He faced Democrat Alfred E. Smith, the first Catholic presidential nominee of a major party. Smith had been born into poverty on New York's Lower East Side, became a Tammany Hall politician, and although Irish, emerged as the spokesman for the new immigrants. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire caused him to support progressive social legislation, and in his 3 terms as New York's governor secured laws limiting working hours for women and children. Smith denounced the Red Scare and called for Prohibition's repeal. The Democratic platform substantially differed from the Republicans only on the issue of Prohibition. Smith's Catholicism became the primary campaign issue and symbolized a cultural clash between native-born Protestant whites and the new immigrants. Although Hoover was elected by 58% of the vote, riding on the prosperity of the decade, Smith's campaign, which won the support of urban voters and farmers, laid the basis for the triumphant Democratic coalition of the 1930s. On October 29th, 1929, soon known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. A panic ensued, and in 5 hours, $10 billion in market value disappeared. The United States quickly found itself in the Great Depression, the greatest economic calamity in modern history. Signals of impending disaster were visible before October 1929. Southern California and Florida had experienced spectacular real estate booms and busts, which resulted in failed banks and foreclosed mortgages. The highly unequal distribution of income and persistent depression in farming areas reduced Americans' purchasing power. Sale of new autos and household consumer goods stagnated after 1926, and European demand for American goods also declined. A fall in the stock market bubble that had been created in the 1920s by speculators was inevitable, but when it happened, it was so severe that it destroyed many investment companies, wiping out thousands of investors and squelching consumer confidence. Around 26,000 businesses failed in 1930, and those that survived cut back on employment and investment. The gold standard-based financial system could not effectively meet the downturn. Germany defaulted on its reparations, payments to France and Britain, which in turn stopped repaying debts to the U.S. banks. Banks failed throughout the world as depositors withdrew money and millions of families lost their life savings. Stocks momentarily rebounded but soon resumed their precipitous decline. In 1932, the economy hit rock bottom with GNP down by a third, prices down by 40%, and more than 11 million workers, which is 25% of the labor force, unemployed. Those who had jobs faced reduced wages and hours. Every industrial economy suffered, but the United States was hit the hardest. The Depression quickly transformed Americans' lives as hundreds of thousands took to the road to look for work, stood in bread lines, erected shack cities called Hoovervilles, and cities exhausted their poor relief. The Depression actually reversed the long-standing migration of Americans from farms to cities as people tried to find land to grow food for their families. The suicide rate rose to its highest level in American history, and the birth rate dropped to its lowest. Also damaged was the public image of big business and Wall Street, which were shown to have thrived on the shady dealings such as the sale of worthless bonds. Many Americans responded to the Depression with resignation or blamed themselves for their economic woes. Others responded with protests that were at first spontaneous and lacking in coordination because the unions, socialist groups, and others that might have led them had been devastated in the 1920s. In early 1932, 20,000 unemployed World War I veterans who marched on Washington to demand early payment of a bonus due in 1945 were dispersed by federal troops. Throughout America, demonstrations of the unemployed demanded work and relief. Farmers protested low prices by temporarily blocking roads to prevent goods from getting to market. The small Communist Party was the only group that seemed able to channel and direct the discontent. Communists formed unemployed councils that organized marches, demonstrated for public assistance, and opposed evictions of unemployed families. The newspapers worried that America was close to revolution. To many Americans, President Hoover's response to the Depression seemed inadequate and lacking in compassion. His advisors told him that depressions were a normal function of capitalism that removed uncompetitive firms and encouraged moral virtue among the unfortunate. Businessmen vehemently opposed federal assistance to the jobless, and many suggested that individuals would survive the Depression through thrift. Federal policymakers who had never faced an economic crisis of this magnitude did not realize how consumer spending supported much of the economy. Most did not believe that federal assistance to the unemployed would spur economic recovery. Hoover maintained his commitment to associational action, strongly opposed direct federal economic intervention, and believed that private charity and voluntary action by business to keep up investments and employment would suffice. He called together business and labor leaders and established commissions to encourage firms to coordinate maintaining prices and wages without government regulation. Hoover's public reassurances that the economy was recovering clashed with reality and made him seem ignorant of the problems facing many ordinary Americans. Some of Hoover's actions, such as the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised already high taxes on imported goods, caused other nations to retaliate and decreased international trade, which exacerbated the crisis. A tax increase Hoover won from Congress in order to balance the budget further reduced consumers' purchasing power. By 1932, even Hoover conceded that voluntary measures were insufficient. He signed laws creating the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which loaned money to failing banks, railroads, and other businesses, and the Federal Home Loan Bank System, which gave aid to homeowners threatened with foreclosure. Although he had vetoed bills to create employment with public works projects like road and bridge construction, he now approved $2 billion for such projects and local relief. But Hoover refused to do anything further, including direct aid to the unemployed, which he told Congress would be a disservice to the jobless. In the mid-1920s, some intellectuals had worried that the prevailing notion of freedom in America celebrated unbound economic enterprise yet accepted limits on free speech and expression and other civil liberties. Though the prosperity of the 1920s reinforced this laissez-faire conception of freedom, the Great Depression and Hoover's failed response discredited it. By 1932, the basis for a new conception of freedom, based on progressive-style positive state action in the economy and a respect for civil liberties and cultural pluralism, was already present and would become the foundation of modern 20th century liberalism.